The CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. The presentation was delivered with slides. To view those slides, or to learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. Hi everybody, my name is Paul McGee. I'm the Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research here at the University of Canberra. I want to start by acknowledging that we're here on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and to all First Nations people here in the audience today. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Jen Webb. Jen is Distinguished Professor Emerita of Creative Practice at the University of Canberra. A poet and cultural theorist, she has published a number of books on key concepts in culture. Her recent poetry collections include Moving Targets, Flight Mode, and The Daily News. And I'll just add before handing over to Jen that she is actually the author of that extremely modest bio that I just read, so I'll just append one or two things to it. Starting with the fact that Jen has played a founding role in creative writing and creative arts research in Australia and has really had a transformative influence on the field for decades. Her works have been published in multiple languages, I won't list them, but also she is the inaugural director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research and is an ongoing and huge support to me in this work. So please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for coming. I did not forget to delete the lorem ipsum. In fact, I came in just as Paul and John were saying, should we cut it out? Looks like I left there because I was telling Paul when I was doing Latin at school about 2 million years ago, our teacher would occasionally put up similar sort of things and say, okay, translate that. This is an unseen, what's called Latin unseen. So translate that. And those of us who were really good, keen students would just slave over it. And those who weren't said, nah, that's not Latin. And I just think it's funny that they use that on the university template for PowerPoint, because it means we struggle to make sense of something that has no sense to it at all. And so that's my stupid personal joke. And also the reason I didn't take it out. Sorry, folks. It's about art and human rights. I'm going to wear my glasses so I can see you and hopefully see the screen. Art and health, well-being. Human rights is part of that, but I was just reviewing a paper on art and human rights. So it's in my head. It is something that humans do, using creative practices for well-being, and have done for a very long time. Jeanette Winterson, the writer, has a very nice turn of phrase in this regard. She wrote a memoir with the fantastic title of Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal? And this line is, fiction and poetry are doses, are medicines. What they heal is the rupture that reality makes on the imagination. She's not the first. The epigraph in the Library of Alexandria, which is about 300 BCE, names the library as medicine for the mind, or some translators have remedy for the mind. And the Library of Ramesses II at Thebes, which is the oldest authenticated library, carries what is not surprisingly the oldest library motto. And that motto is, this place is the house of healing for the soul. So in the ancient world, minds and souls were healed by books, by creative stuff. Over the last 2.5 millennia, literary language has been associated with and often embedded in arts practice. Ria Joyce Rubin wrote a book that was published in 1978, so it's a wee bit out of date now. It was called Using Bibliotherapy. It sets out a timeline of books being used actually as medicine. She starts with those two ancient libraries, then jumps forward to the first time that reading was prescribed as a treatment, and that was in 2072, when the Al Mansour Hospital in Cairo began prescribing readings of the Quran to their patients as part of treatment. They probably also offered music therapy, but there's less evidence of that than there is of reading. Following the Cairo initiative, Reuben jumps over several centuries and identifies that throughout Europe from sort of 14th, 15th century, books started being prescribed in hospitals and prisons across Europe, mostly religious texts. By the 18th century, they were also giving books to patients in psychiatric hospitals. In the 19th century, in the US, they began giving books, periodicals, newspapers, and non-religious texts to promote healing of both mind and body. The seminal article on bibliotherapy was published in the US in 1846. It's titled The Treatment of Insanity. That's him, John Minson Galt II. He was a pioneer of bibliotherapy in the US. He transformed the treatment of the mentally ill. He was also an early advocate of the logic that the mentally ill are, in his words, quote, people like us. So he wrote that essay, which got quite widely picked up. In 1853, he wrote an essay titled On Reading, Recreation and Amusements for the Insane. Language we wouldn't use now, but if you think back then, in the 19th century, he was thinking very seriously about how to infuse people with the tools for healing. Reading and words and metaphors all have a remarkably long and well-evidenced role in well-being, and there is evidence of their efficacy. We can push the data of the emergence of bibliotherapy not just back to 300 BCE, but back well before the writing actually emerged. Professor of psychology Simon Duplock does this. He argues that the therapeutic function of literature has probably been known, he says, since the most ancient traditions. And you see it in the oral practice of storytelling, which well predates writing and publishing, and which still continues in different ways across all cultures. It seems that there is something in the patterning of language, something in the spark it strikes in the human brain that does us good and does us bad. Wittgenstein, of course, that bleak thinker, writes in Philosophical Investigations, I'll quote him, "Philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of our language." A battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of our language. And he has a point. Propaganda is a story-based form of communication. Xenophobic songs and poems use the techniques of literary writing to bewitch our imaginations. The mic drop case, I think, for how the fact that art can be good and can be bad is Ramesses himself. He's also known as Ozymandias, which I'm sure you know. He turns out to have been a lot less interested in literature and people's souls than in power, and the hubris that comes with that. And Shelley's poem, Ozymandias, which I'm sure everybody knows, actually deals with this. He describes a vast, collapsed statue in the desert, and on the pedestal of which is inscribed, this is the poem, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." And then the poet comes in. "Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." So Ozymandias / Ramesses, his political power has dissolved into sand. Libraries continue, writing continues, storing and music and poems and art continues. And I've been talking about literary arts, and I started there because their associations with health are very traceable. Writing leaves a readily traced record, but other art forms are equally involved. There is an argument that visual art was used for wellness in the deep past. Daisy Fancourt wrote a chapter of her 2017 book, Arts in Health, on its use in prehistory. She argues, with evidence, a visual art begins in the Paleolithic era, most likely the mid-Paleolithic. And this claim is based on early artifacts that date to around 300,000 years ago. Some of these actually might be artifacts of natural events, not of human interventions, but there isn't any question about the role of humans in cave paintings, for instance, and in some sculptures that are clearly worked rather than appearing by chance. And these sorts of work appear from 250,000 years ago to 30,000 years ago. Towards the end of the Paleolithic era, which is about 35,000 years ago, bird bones have turned up. Well, they haven't turned up, archaeologists found them. Bird bones carved into what appear to be flutes and other musical instruments. So our great-great-great-great-grandparents were across story, poetry, song, musicianship, painting, drawing and sculpture. And there's also indications that they were doing dance because there's footprints impressed in the mud that show, mud of cave floors, that show not random movements, but deliberate movements. What Fancourt says is it's remarkable that particularly the sculptures that she's identifying were clearly created specifically to support rituals around fertility and health. And so for her, art and health have been interwoven from the very beginning. The other point she makes, I think is worth thinking about in terms of the arts-health nexus, is the use of art forms in ritual, which they have been clearly, there's evidence they have been for a long time, rather than just using them as treatments for health. And what I find very attractive here is that ritual is intrinsic to the creation and maintenance of social bonds. And social bonds, social cohesion, is a really important factor and increasingly understood to be a vital factor in health and well-being. So for Fancourt, and I would tend to agree with her, the evidence around the birth of the arts in early human rituals points to the intertwining of art and healing and health. So the birth of art is also the birth of arts in health. If her and other people's summaries are correct, I see no reason to doubt them, it seems that the application of art for health or well-being started at the beginning of Homo sapiens sapiens as a species. Wasn't institutionalized as art for health until, as I mentioned, in the hospital in Cairo, they started using readings, and more specifically by the 18th century in Europe. Just a few examples. Henry Fuseli was doing work on mental illness. That one's probably about sleep paralysis. Peter de Graves, like many others, was doing physiological drawings that doctors use to understand the human body. William Hogarth produced many drawings and prints about bad medical practice, including, this is the bone setters, and other abuses performed by medical practitioners. By the 19th century, we start to see a more formalized use of art for mental health. By the 20th century, a clinical and therapeutic structure was properly set up around arts health, and the name therapy applied to it. And most commentators date this as happening from 1942. There are some really interesting examples of earlier practices of what we might call art therapy, and this was actual medical practitioners using creative practice to help their patients recover. World War I is a perfect example of that because there was so much work happening. One example of this has only just come to light last year. The BBC report on it. A World War I nurse called Jean Thompson, who I'm delighted to say, after this, went off and trained as a doctor, which was very unusual for women then. She kept a journal during 1917 when she was nursing the war wounded in a Glasgow hospital. And her journal appeared when her daughter died, and her granddaughter cleaned out mum's house, found a trunk in the attic, looked inside the trunk, bang, it's pretty exciting. Her journal has her own record of how they were treating physically and psychologically wounded soldiers. There also has quite a lot of drawings and paintings by patients in the hospital. And there's examples also on the trunk that her granddaughter found of necklaces and other artifacts that these men had produced. So that's 1917, and doing it very, very deliberately and formally. These days, health practitioners are really comfortable, on the whole, in considering how art can help remediate patients' sufferings. Art interventions are quite common in health practice, but in those early days, 1917, right up to 1942, art therapy wasn't well established or wasn't well aligned with health professional clinical practice. First becomes an approved practice beyond the action of many individual doctors and nurses due to the work of the British artist Adrian Hill. He actually coined the term art therapy. He was a World War I veteran. He served in the trenches, and he also served as Imperial War Museum artist who ran foul, as many of them did, of the War Office because they would paint what they actually saw rather than painting celebratory and triumphal work. They weren't allowed to exhibit paintings of terrible things. And a couple of them did exhibit them, but under brown paper, so no one could see them, just they could say, yeah, to the war artist. I think it's probably a kind of inverse art therapy, like the government thinking, well, if you don't show the horrors, then it didn't happen, and then there's no need for therapy. You're all fine. Okay? It was after World War I, though, that Hill had his own coming to art therapy moment. In 1938, he was suffering from tuberculosis, so he was a patient in the hospital, and he spent time there soothing himself by drawing and painting because he was an artist. 1939, they started introducing occupational therapy to that hospital. He said, I'll help, and he started teaching visual art to other patients. And then when he recovered, he worked with the British Red Cross, offering art appreciation classes to people in hospital. So this twofold approach, making art, appreciating art, it really came into its own in the mid-40s at Netherton Hospital, which is a psychiatric unit in Surrey. The artist Edward Adamson, who'd been working with Adrian Hill at the TB Hospital, began running art groups with patients. What a jolly chap. He was appointed to Netherton Hospital not as a medical officer, not as a therapy officer. He was specifically as an artist, probably the first one to be appointed under those terms. His title was art director, and for him that was the right way to designate it. He pointed out he's not a medical person. It's not his role to analyse the patients, to diagnose their condition, or to even to examine the art produced by them to understand more about their condition. He just wanted to support them in art practice and art appreciation. In a history of an echo of John Winston Galt's view, he said, quote, "I just want to see them as people, not as patients." In the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, we're doing something very similar. Before I think any of us had read this literature, when we first started off working with Defence in 2014, and with their wounded, injured and ill service personnel who just recently returned from the Middle East arena, we called our approach creative interventions, absolutely distinguishing it from art therapy because it wasn't therapy, it was art practice. I think one of the reasons we could do this is from those earliest days, 1917, 1940, a relationship had emerged between art and therapy that seems to have engendered a productive tension between reason and imagination. And that productive tension helps to bridge the divide between clinical and non-clinical interventions. A key issue is that the making of art, whether it's literary or visual or performance art, requires the participant to engage different parts of their brain than they engage in everyday life. And so it engenders physiological effects that help to heal the brain. And I can tell you what neurologists say about it, but it would take too long, and I'm not a neurologist. But the approach we use has proved to be helpful in ameliorating the suffering of people living with PTSD, living with other psychological and to some extent physical traumas. We haven't been allowed to do actual proper analysis of the participants because they're defence personnel, but there's been lots of longitudinal observation of the participants, and it shows sustained improved health and well-being even years after the person was in the programme. Significantly reduced suicidal ideation, significantly reduced family breakdown or work failure, virtually no instances of suicide, which is astounding, I think. We're not doing art therapy because, like Edward Adamson, we don't ask what's wrong with the participant. And they are participants, they're not patients. The approach treats each person as someone who's taking the opportunity to find a way of expressing themselves creatively. A couple of examples. So they do, in the early days we had theatre, group devised productions, always had music, always had creative writing. They write all over the walls in the room, they read their works out in public, they make little books that Karen shows them how to bind. They do visual art, a lot of visual art, which may or may not reflect what they've seen in war zones. Some programs, there's a lot of horrifying stuff. Some programs, it's, flowers and graffiti. And there's masses of music, singing, playing, solo, group. It's really an energetic month-long program. Most of the programs that we in the CCR have run, I say we as though I did it. It wasn't me. I just looked and wrote about it. Everybody else was doing the work. Most of it has been conducted with people in communities suffering from trauma. Of course, there's returned service personnel who've been deployed to war zones. Then first responders in the ACT in New South Wales. And these professionals are people who have to see things no one should ever have to see. And then began going out to rural communities who experienced traumatic harm as a result of environmental catastrophe. Jordan and Tony started this, and Jordan and Tony finished it. There was a lot of real energy working, and in this case, it wasn't about experts flying into the regions, doing a seagull thing, doing workshops and disappearing. It was experts going in there, finding the local artists, working with the local artists, taking them through trauma-informed care training and showing them how to do it so that you leave a lasting legacy there. All these sorts of programs are designed to give participants some skills in music or visual art or writing, not necessarily to become a great artist, but to kickstart the healing of the brain so it sends out less troubling messages to the rest of their body so they can understand and imagine a different self and craft a way for themselves out of that trauma or pain. It's expanded a lot, not because of us, but because most of our PhD candidates. Pauline Griffiths, who graduated a little while ago, came up with a way of helping people living with dementia, living in residential aged care, to experience greater contentment, to have a life that's more worth living. And she came up with a program of activities for creative care that's cheap to implement, which is nice, and doesn't require specifically trained presenters, like the staff in the units can run it. It's been approved by NDIS and is being delivered by her and others in Melbourne. Another, what is her name? Kerry Martin considered the impact of sexual abuse on children, and her PhD explored how artistic engagement with the content of the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, that's a very long title, could act as a platform to continue conversations around issues of social injustice. some of her work. Her project differs from those in that she wasn't teaching other people to do it, but what she was doing was building a platform in which survivors can comment and family members can engage and interact with her and with each other, and to continue with the work of rebuilding the social capital that might allow them to live better with the effects of the trauma. There's been a huge change in the 21st century in the focus on art for health and well-being. A lot of research being conducted globally, a plethora of programs and initiatives established, and masses of evaluation conducted. This is particularly for programs outside art therapy as such, because that works in the clinical base, and there's the normal sort of clinical evaluations. These are more social evaluations. We've connected with extensive networks of other people doing similar sort of things. Spent some time in the US, and so did Ian Drayton, with the veterans of the US Forever War, particularly through the military establishment's art therapy complex in Philadelphia. They're doing some pretty amazing work. And I also, in 2018, spent time in Gainesville, Florida, collaborating with clinical practitioners, artists, art therapists, medical researchers, educators, and also the patients at the University of Florida Center for Arts and Medicine and the affiliated Veterans Affairs program across the road at the Malcolm Randall Center. I came away from these experiences with a lot of observations. Perhaps given my then role as director of a research center, and so being responsible for wellbeing programs, it's clear that a creative intervention alone is not sufficient. All our workshops for people who are suffering are conducted by artists, mentors, yes, but there's also usually nurses and psychologists going along with them. They aren't necessarily needed. But if you take a group of distressed people and plunge them into the stressful, if exciting situation of making art and thinking in ways they haven't thought before, it's useful to have some number of specializations to support them, just in case things go wrong. This includes art training, art therapy, psychology, occupational therapy, physical therapy, and often speech therapy in a coordinated system of delivery. If you're doing a lot of things, we're doing small, so we can't take all those therapists with us. Paul Crawford, Professor Paul Crawford in the UK, is a pioneer of health humanities in the university context. He was actually the first person called a professor of health humanities. He's demonstrated the value and the validity of this area for quite a long time now, set up an international network of researchers, collaborates with health providers and other social actors. These are the titles of some of the books he didn't write. He wrote the bottom one, but he commissioned the others. These are books not for academics. These are for end users, about how to use photography or reading or performing arts or creative writing or poetry or video games for health and well-being outcomes. They're small, they're affordable, they're really, really useful for people who are going to be arts mentors, or for people who think, I'm sick of living like this, I want to make a change. That can be very useful. In Edinburgh, I spent time with an organisation called Luminate, which began life as a festival for creative ageing in Scotland and has become the peak body for ageing well. It supports grassroots and local organisations across Scotland, offering training in various art forms, lots of community initiatives, participation in a biennial Scotland-wide festival, kind of fun. The name Luminate, by the way, was the product of a process. They couldn't decide what to call it and what language to use. So finally they recruited a poet. And the poet listened to people, looked at all the consultation. She said, everything people say about aging is dark. Okay? So let's do something that's light. And so she suggests the name Luminate, which is not a real word, but has the sense of lumen and has a sense of illuminate. And the director said to me, Luminate is like illuminate without the ill. And I think that's great. In the ACT, we've had a lot of uptake of arts health approach. The ACT Government Wellbeing Framework provides a very reasonable foundation for such initiatives. Our art centres, especially Tuggeranong and Belco, have a good record of delivering programs. Tuggeranong has what they term the Messenger Programme, which several of our colleagues and staff have worked on over the long time it's been around. It's a non-clinical intervention for people aged 10 to 25 who are disengaging from school, their community, becoming socially isolated, becoming bad social behaviours and so on, and becoming suicidal. It actually started as a suicide prevention programme for young people in 2000, and it's still running. In Belconnen, there's the Ignite programme, which is for artists who identify as disabled, deaf, hard of hearing, chronically ill, neurodiverse, blah, blah, blah. And both Belco and Tuggeranong offer dance programme for people living with Parkinson's. Belco has the dance for wellbeing for people with dementia. So these are pretty well established in Canberra. The UK has been a leader in alternatives to conventional health and community health. They came up with the term social prescribing, which is a very close relative of arts health. It's now being promoted by the World Health Organization, which has developed a toolkit on how to implement it. As a term, as a practice, social prescribing is becoming more established in Australia. It's almost exactly the same as arts health, but it focuses because it focuses not on symptoms but on underlying causes. But it differs because it has all sorts of activities, bushwalking and fishing and swimming as well, and soccer as well as art. That's what social prescribing is for who? A means for healthcare workers to connect patients to a range of non-clinical services in the community to improve health and well-being. And the connection is done by what they call link workers, and that's a term that's being used here. Our colleagues in the Faculty of Health have taken up social prescribing with real enthusiasm and skill. They work on ageing issues through the Centre for Ageing Research and Translation, which is actually called CARET, which is nice. They work on community wellbeing through the Health Research Institute programs. The latter are particularly very involved in social prescribing, largely because their research shows that Bruce and Belconnen have the highest levels of isolation and alienation in Australia. So they're helping people to rebuild networks and connections. Any social prescribing requires a network of what the UK, as I said, call link workers, and GPs and health professionals refer them to link workers. They spend time with the person, get to know them, and recommend an appropriate activity. But with all the activities they recommend, the key issue is that they're done with others, because we get better when we have healthy social intercourse and begin to feel that we are part of a community. I suspect, and this is self-interested of course, but there is some research that supports me, that art has the edge on other social prescribing activities, primarily because it's playful. Learning to make creative things. There's our Kathy, who's the queen of play. Learning to make creative things is scary, it is a bit stressy, but it's not instrumental, it's playful. It's not competitive because you could never get it right. So it means that it's not about getting somewhere, it's about being you, playing. Any output you make is a good output because you made it and you learn something about yourself in the making in that process. Sadly for artists there's no monetary outcomes, but that gladly means it's not operationalized, it's just play. Now I think here the sociologist Thomas Henrik, who said play is a laboratory of the possible. It takes us outside the ordinary world to step into a more interesting world where we can be other. However, there's always a however, I'll finish with this, none of this happens by magic. It happens because there are people around who understand what is involved in art used for health purposes. It happens because there are institutions who will support and fund and legitimate it. It happens because there are individual artists who can deliver the programs, and that individual artist is the one that interests me most at the moment. There is very little evidence yet about what it means to be a mentor, an artist provider. The current literature does show what there is, shows that arts mentors who work with trauma-affected individuals and communities in particular are exposed to risks, particularly emotional fatigue and stress and burnout. The need for strong self-care practices has been highlighted, right? We're going to get you to do this really difficult work. Look after yourself, take care. They've also promoting the need for health, they being organisations, promoting the need for peer support and a commitment to work-life balance, although I don't see any organisation rushing to support work-life balance. I say without real business. Emerging evidence suggests that arts mentors can also experience positive outcomes like increased empathy, increased confidence, and enhanced artistic practices. But there's very little literature on how these programs are set up, how they're directed, what the curriculum is, who leads them, how they're resourced. So that means that there's an absence of knowledge, which means there's likely to be a lot of inconsistencies in how they're practiced, and insufficient evidence in terms of evaluation, what works, what doesn't work. Problem of standards really is what it's about. It's definitely a recognised problem in the UK. Professor Helen Chatterjee from the University College of London is focusing on this aspect, the who does the work aspect of social prescribing. And she's been researching this for about 15 years. And she told me, I met her for coffee, she said there's major issues around all sorts of things. What is a link worker? What kind of qualifications do you need? What kind of training do you need? What critical support is there for you? She says there's no real job description, even though the role's been around for a long time. There are about 4,000 link workers now in the UK, all sorts of backgrounds and skills, being paid almost nothing. So following her lead, my current research is looking at the mentors in our arts health programs and gradually other ACT arts health programs, beginning to build an understanding of who's doing the work, who they are, what they bring, what they need. And I'll finish there. Okay.
Great. Thanks so much, Jen. Comments or questions? Look, I might start off. Jen, I was starting to think in my head as you were taking us through that tour of the link between literature and the creative arts and health over millennia. I was thinking of the figure of the doctor who is also usually a writer. Like I was thinking of William Carlos Williams, Chekhov came to mind.
Goldsworthy?
Goldsworthy, yes.
Yeah.
They seem to make a separation between their creative practice and their repair work. I think that's true, isn't it?
I think that's true. They are mostly general practitioners or specialist practitioners rather than hospital-based workers. And they're seeing people for that particular specialised problem and they're treating it. And then they're writing. But Peter Goldsworthy is somebody I interviewed a few years back under our project, the Poetry and Excellence Project. And he said he definitely does write about his experiences as a medico. He doesn't write about patients, but he writes about feelings, the logic, the senses. You don't see as much in his fiction, but there actually is quite a lot in his poetry. I suspect that William Carlos Williams, he does talk about the need for poetry for society. You know, men die every day for want of what is in the news, for instance, which should be poetry. And I don't think if you're thoughtful, creative, intelligent person, that you ever stop being both those things, both the artist and the professional, whatever it might be. Even if you aren't doing explicitly like running arts programs, you're still thinking about it, you're still engaging with it at some level, I think.
Alex.
Thank you. Thanks, Jen. I was looking forward to this. A couple of things. Just one point that I just read briefly an article earlier today that people have suddenly discovered that an infusion of micro dose of joy apparently really helps you. And I just thought, really? No kidding. Right. Okay. So, but the other thing is in terms of a museum background, but also wondering how it's going in terms of the ACT Wellbeing framework and how that's being applied across the ACT. You mentioned it, you've been involved in it, but I'm really interested in that.
Very loosely involved, mostly holding on to Kathy Hope's coattails. But as far as I can see at present, there's a lot of talk about how it's going to be implemented, but not a lot of implementation that I've been able to identify yet. What I suspect it might do, for one thing, it validates the work. That's an important thing. It's certainly galvanizing in some organizations, sense of we really need to think about the well-being of our customers, our audiences, whoever it might be, and I think that's useful. And I think once it becomes more widely adopted and disseminated, we may well see a lot more pop-ups of well-being. Because it does happen also, the microdose happens all sorts of ways. So the Defence Arts thing is, it's 4 weeks, 9 to 5 every day over those 4 weeks, which is very, very intense and very exhausting. And of course, you get benefits from that you don't get out of an afternoon workshop. But you get benefits out of an afternoon workshop you probably don't get out of that 4-week intensive. So I think a combination of microdosing, random pop-ups, little activities that people engender themselves, rather than going through an institution, may well be an outcome, or was at least supported and facilitated by that. And the language does give us the validation to say, this matters, this is important.
Thanks, Jen. It was great. Further to Alex's comment, I've recently retired from CFC, ACT Historic Places, and CMAG, and certainly a lot of our public programming had that wellness foundation sitting underneath it, and we also reported against it, which I think is interesting. Whether or not that reporting is going any further than internally, I'm not sure. But I wanted to go back to what you were talking about before, and I was listening with a personal kind of hat on around a lot of the things that we see in these kinds of areas are around specific, like dementia or Parkinson's or whatever. But I know just within my family that there is decline through just ageing, through things like arthritis and injuries from the past that have debilitated people and things like that. So that whole kind of a general malaise, really, that GPs, you know, like, you want people to use this kind of approach to actually pull people out of something that spirals down and then takes their health with them, and to a point where they can't actually bring themselves back up again. And that, you know, the general GP, the general person who comes in and gets a new prescription and gets sent away with more tablets, maybe this social prescription is something that should be much more focused on in general medicine and for general practitioners and those kinds of things. That was a bit
That's
long,
a really good
sorry.
point. To start with the first one, I didn't want to mention the organisation because Kathy and I have been trying to be involved, as you know, for a couple of years, but the chaos we've had here has just vitiated against that for CMAG and CFC. In the UK, those chronic and intractable conditions that make people's lives miserable, increasingly doctors are sending them, they're not prescribing drugs, they're sending them to units of social prescribing. There's units, there's actual formal institutions in many of the major cities in the UK where they'll say, okay, go make an appointment, go and see those folk. And they'll be allocated a link worker who'll spend their time with them and saying, what do you like to do? And find ways to just make their life happier. Because the microdosing, however true or not it may be, there's not that much, I mean, no one's happy all the time. But if you can have an okay day, that's pretty damn fine.
Yeah. The problem in this instance is it's rural and quite rural. And so, you know, doctors, there's probably a limited number of medicos in the town and just moving people through. But anyway, it's just a comment.
No, a rural one is a particular problem for all sorts of health issues. But I think now of another of our colleagues, Ronnie Ailiff in Cobargo. Cobargo burnt half to the ground in the fires 2019, 2020. And she has been, as a local, raising lots of money to build a resilience centre and also working with her community to have all kinds of little local programs. So having embedded artists, which is what we're trying to do with the regeneration project I showed you, having embedded artists who can actually pick up some of that slack is one way around, because there's been an awful lot of sea changing, and tree changing. And a lot of artists have gone out to the bush and places, and they are often themselves quite lonely and isolated. And this is a way for them to connect with and become part of the community while really giving something back. I'm a dreamer.
It's me again, Alex. Has there been any pushback from psychiatrists and psychologists and other health professionals, particularly of the mind, and I think particularly in the UK where this is far more established?
No, I guess about 20 years ago, I remember talking to psychologists about this before we were doing this, before I really knew very much about it. And they said even then that even narrative psychology, which is a recognized form, is voodoo magic. But they can't say that anymore because there's clinical evidence of the efficacy of narrative psychology. There's also increasingly evidence, not in the usual qualitative, I feel better or look at those happy people ways, but with the Defence Arts Programme, for instance, we don't deal with the participants in terms of how they're doing, where they're going, but the defence psychologists do. And they've actually presented several papers over the years which show actual, you know, the T-scores and the degrees of error and so on from the statistical work on how these people are going. And so that, again, that calms the nerves of older-fashioned or more traditional medicos to say, it may not be actual medicine, but it has physiological effects. My brother's a neurologist, and I was telling him about the program and saying, oh, it's all art and magic and expression, it's fantastic. And he said, no, it's not. He said, it's mechanical. They're in a stressful, exciting situation, which makes the blood rush to the frontal lobe, which brings food and oxygen to the frontal lobe, takes away the rubbish, does it again, cleans out the frontal lobe, helps lay down new synaptic pathways. So that's a medicalized view of what it does. I felt quite sad at first when he told me. I thought, of course it's not, of course it's about the wonders of art. But it actually is about the wonders of art, because that's what starts it all.
It does sound like a brother, might I say.
It does sound like a brother.
But actually, just to back up what Jen's saying, with the Defence Arts Program, which has been running for, 11 years now, there's been 2 PhDs on it, one quantitative, one qualitative, and both came out with such flying colours that they convinced Defence to continue funding. So, you know, to get past the kind of scrutiny that's operative there meant that we had to have pretty extraordinary results, and we did. I did see reference somewhere to one critique of social prescribing in the UK. I've forgotten the figure. I mean, it seemed to be the sort of critique that is you know, that any innovation attracts from certain, you know, contrarian members of the community. That I know there is a little bit there, but I think it's overwhelmed by the amount
I think
of
the
positive
problems with
support.
social prescribing in the UK is the overwhelm. It's grown too quickly. There aren't any standards. It's not properly regulated. Nobody wants to stop it because it saves so much money. I mean, the government reports all show how much it takes out of the burden of the health budget. But they aren't looking after the link workers. They aren't following through necessarily very well on programs and projects. So yeah, it's by no means perfect, but all these things they're initiatives. I mean, in the UK it's a long initiative, but nonetheless it's not as entrenched as conventional medicine is. But increasingly medicos are actually recognising that there is medical benefit to it.
And also it cuts down on their caseloads.
It does cut down their caseloads. And it makes patients. Owen's been doing work with patients in the rehab hospital and poetry workshops. And I've heard directly from somebody I knew who was there who said it changed their life, recovering from stroke. And, you know, it gave them back language and a sense of self, sense of being.
Do you want to comment at all, Owen?
No, it's nice to hear that.
Okay, great. Okay, I'll pass back to Alex.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just so intrigued. What would you like to talk a little bit about? There's an incredible divide between the instrumental use of art, culture, museums, and intrinsic value. It's a massive divide. And of course, social prescribing's falling on the side of instrumental. Can you talk a little bit about the potential, the possibilities, the positives, the negatives of that? Because the intrinsic value is so important and it's under such threat.
I spent nearly 10 years investigating the creative industries, a term I despise, but which is used widely across the Anglosphere and to some extent in Europe as well. And that's the same sort of thing. The creative stuff is valuable when it generates income. And there's all this data that shows the enormous amounts of money that come in from the creative industries, by which they mean architects, software designers, public speakers, public communication, PR. Not what we do, not what museums do, not what artists do. Art has for a long time suffered from the fact that it isn't instrumental, and this is very much becoming even more visible with late capitalism. So as long as we're stuck with capitalism, and at the moment we seem to be, we have to find ways to get around it sneakily. And I'm quite unashamedly say that I pushed as director of the CCCR for us to do health things, because that would help us secure our position in a university. And universities don't like arts and humanities. As we can see, they've been closing those units down all around the world. So how do you make yourself of use? You pretend, or you do things that look as though they have an instrumental operationalizing face to them, that do in fact support things I can live with. I can live with something that makes people's lives better, that makes people healthier. I'm fine with that. As long as we can really focus on the making and the dissemination, distribution of creative works. And Helen Chatterjee from UCL, who I mentioned, I knew she was an expert in social prescribing, and I presume she was a creative. Turns out that she's a zoologist. And I said, that's kind of unusual entry. And she said, well, her first job was as a curator of a zoology museum. And she saw people coming into the museum, and she listened to them, and she realized that something about being around the displays done in different ways, reading the materials, was good for them, that they felt better for it. And so she took that up from a real off-piste way of getting into it. Yeah. So there isn't anything we can do, it seems, to persuade the authorities and government that something that is with priceless is not also worthless. And art is priceless. Museums are priceless. But if you're priceless, then you have fallen outside the economy, which means effectively you're worthless. So we have to find other ways to tell the story. So I don't think there's any good way of talking about it. It doesn't. all the skills that come from art practice, art training, humanities training are vital to employers. They're vital to the community. They're vital to the future. But they don't look like business management 1 or STEM, and so they're just discounted. But we're still here.
I think there's something hopeful in that final note, actually. And look, let's finish up here. Please join me again in thanking Jen for taking us through such terrain.